Hi folks. So just a brief call out to one of my subscribers, Toxic Holy Grenade. In the last video, I think you asked me would I cover the events in France, the recent riots. Um, I was going to do that actually, but then the riots sort of seemed to calm down a bit, so it went on to the next news item. I guess I could talk about it briefly in this video, because there is some overlap with some of the issues we've had in the UK. Um, The UK's had a number of urban riots over the years. In the 1980s, of course, 1981, the Toxteth riots, the Broadwater Farm riots in Tottenham, I believe, was 1985. The Brixton riots. There was riots in the years 81, 85, serious riots in 81. 1993 in the West End of Newcastle. Handsworth, Birmingham in 2005. And there's been other incidents of individual unrest in cities, but of course it was the 2011 England-wide riots, which are probably most comparable to what's happened in France. No, I wasn't going to make this whole video about this, but it definitely taps into it. Um, in France, this isn't the first example of serious urban unrest. I remember when I was at university, 2005 and 2006 were serious riots. And again, it's involved predominantly North African youths in the so-called banlieues, that is the suburbs of northern Paris. Um, and I think there's no question about it. There's a serious gulf in the French state and these youths. And in Britain, we are not much better. Um, it's been a while since we've had that sort of nationwide unrest. The last one was 2011, but that was pretty serious. 5 people died in that unrest, and it spread to cities across England. Not the whole UK, I should add, but across England. Um, I'm not going to get into a sort of deep analysis here of the causes and all of that. It would just take too long. Um, but I do want to get into a certain mentality that lies behind young offenders, and particularly young men involved in this sort of stuff. Now, first of all, about the specific situation in France recently, I think the officer responsible should definitely face charges that he is, and he could face a long prison sentence. Based on the video available, I've seen it a couple of times. He says that he felt threatened, but he was shooting the suspect in the back. Um, and I think there's no justification for that. He shot the guy in cold blood, so there's no justification and he should face charges. But it's also very clear to me that there are a lot of opportunists, just as there were in the 2011 England riots, who use this as an excuse to basically go out and vandalize, burn cars, and so on. Um, it's often said, sort of gallows humor, that rioting is a French national sport. But this is not a laughing matter. There's a serious side to it, because when you have that sort of polarization, I think that there is anger out there, and this could easily break out again. Calm down now, but it could easily break out again. All it takes is another black or Arab youth to be stopped by police, and the situation escalates, or killed by police. And my take on that, because I think actually the situation in Britain is not that different. It's probably a little bit worse in France, but I don't think it's, I don't think we can be complacent about this. Um, it's just balancing act, because I think stop and search definitely has merit. Stop and search has been proven to be effective. There has been examples of knife carriers being apprehended, and if it wasn't for stop and search, they would have went out and stabbed someone, because every young offender says they carry a knife for self-protection. So then it becomes this narrative whereby everyone uses it as an excuse. Um, so stop and search literally saves lives, and I think there is evidence to that effect. But I was reading in the Times, for example, that one young man said that he'd been stopped many times and he'd done nothing. Now, that will breed resentment, and it's wrong. Um, I believe that ultimately public safety is more important than political correctness. However, I think that where there are frictions, there needs to be work in terms of closing that gap. I don't know what the representation of the French police is in terms of, the ethnic makeup of it. If you have a situation where, most officers are white and most suspects are minorities, obviously there's going to be tension there. But I don't know what the makeup is, so I can't pinpoint that as a factor. Um, but, corrupt officers have to be held to account. In Britain, we do have a problem with corrupt police officers. There's no question about that. No question about it. Um, those officers should not be protected. And it's not good enough to say most police officers are decent. That's not good enough. Because if the decent officers are not speaking up and they're basically presiding over this culture of corruption, they can't complain about being tarred with the same brush. You know, you could be absolutely sure that Wayne Couzens and David Carrick, two of the most extreme cases, they may have been extreme cases, but there would have been a culture that was protecting them. There's no question about it. The Metropolitan Police alone has hundreds and hundreds of ongoing investigations into misconduct. So this can't be just dismissed as some fringe bad apples. I think there's a serious, serious problem. Um, but I'm pro police. I actually want the police to be empowered because I think if you weaken the police, some notions about defunding the police to me are stupid because in the end, I mean, take for example, defund the police because of racism. Well, what happens if you have a racist assault? How do victims of that get justice? Defund the police can't therefore have the resources to investigate it. So it's a stupid idea. But I do believe in police reform. But that shouldn't come at the price of tying the hands of police. Now, this is really a very important thing because I think most reasonable people, what they would want to see is a police force that apprehends criminals, safe, but doesn't abuse their power. Now, I don't think that's too much to ask. And I think some people do get into the police for the wrong reasons. However, I think others are in it for the right reasons because they want to keep the public safe. They see crime and they want to be part of the solution in tackling that. But when there is a gulf between a community and the police, then inevitably that leads to problems. But I also think that there are, frankly, too many excuses made for crime and criminality. Way too many excuses. I mean, to really, really get into the nitty gritty of all the issues here, it would take a lot more than one video. So I know I'm only scratching the surface here, and people are free to disagree with me. But take, for example, poverty. People will say, well, poverty leads to crime. There's certainly truth in that. If you have an area where there's high poverty, chances are it will have higher crime rates. That's a no-brainer. But the problem with sort of that reductionist argument is it then implies that if someone's poor, they are more prone to being a criminal. It negates the fact that there are wealthy criminals, and it negates the fact that many poor people are themselves victims of crime, in fact, probably more so. It's kind of the same argument with young offenders. Whenever people talk tough about young offenders, conservatives talk tough about that, they're accused of vilifying young people. But this ignores the fact that very often most of the victims of young offenders are other young people. And I think it's wrong to imply that teenagers themselves don't want to see justice. If you have a young person who's been a victim of assault or rape or a gang attack or some other serious crime, they're going to feel the same anger as any other victim of crime. They'll want to see justice. And I speak from experience because I dealt with that when I was 16 years old, 15, 16 years old. And I felt angry and I thought, these people belong behind bars. So I think it's a very wrong-headed approach to sort of treat all young people as the same and assume that they all have the same mindset and argue that if you're talking tough regarding young offenders, then it somehow equates to vilifying young people. It's one of those arguments I think it's void. I have a big problem with it actually. Um, this is something I really want to focus on because it's been a problem in this country for years. I mean, there's always been youth crime, always. You can even go back to the Victorian period. People have this kind of rosy-eyed, tinted-eyed view of the past that there was no crime. That's not true. There was crime in the past. I mean, you could look at the 1880s. There was a district of London called the Old Nickel. It was a slum, And there were youth gangs there that would rob people at knife point. So they were just as vicious and just as dangerous. The difference was that punishment was a lot tougher back then, um, and I think perhaps there was more fear of law enforcement on some level. Um, Not universally. Being a Bobby on the beat in Victorian England was no picnic. Um, but I do think that too many excuses are made. And, people talk about solutions to this problem and they talk about, well, the problem is young offenders are bored. Now, I really have a big problem with this argument. And it's not that I say that it isn't a factor. I think it's a no-brainer that if youth clubs are closed, that if there's a lack of investment in your facilities, that isn't going to help the problem. I think that's a no-brainer. But the problem I have with using that as a go-to argument is it basically serves as an excuse. Also, the youth club's closed, so that justifies you, you know, smashing a brick into someone's property, attacking strangers for no reasons. I think it's far too simplistic, and it doesn't get into a more poisonous and more, frankly, evil culture that is out there. I just don't buy this thing about, well, young people are bored, so that's why they do it. Because again, not all young people go to crime. So it's a reductionist argument. I think it's just overly simplistic. Um, and by the same token, saying that if you give opportunities to young people, there'll be no crime. Well, I totally support giving opportunities to young people, but I saw a post earlier this evening, and this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. Um, it basically was about a boxing club opening. Um, it was somewhere in the north of England. I can't, off the top of my head, remember where, Blackburn or uh, Preston. I can't remember. Someone in the northwest. I don't remember exactly, but basically, local councillor was saying this is the only way to tackle antisocial behaviour, get young people involved in this. Well, my attitude to that is, yeah, I'm all for it. It's good. Boxing, for example, could be a good vacuum for young men to unleash their anger in a healthy way. Well, it's not tennis, it's a rough sport, but it's more healthy than attacking a stranger on the street, more healthy than, joining the knife gang. But the only approach, you see, that's a sort of mentality of, well, if we just give young people opportunities, I'm a strong, strong believer in accountability. So what I say is, yes, give opportunities, but this must be coupled with accountability. In other words, if you hurt society, there's no excuse. You have to be held to account. And one of the biggest problems I have with the debate around youth crime is there's far too little responsibility attached to young offenders. Now, if you have a situation where someone has severe learning difficulties, or they're under extreme peer pressure, or something along those lines, then there may be an argument that, they lack responsibility. But you cannot tell me that a 16-year-old or even a 15-year-old doesn't know that violently attacking a stranger for no reason, such as the case I recently cited in Torquay, in fact, they were older, they were 18 and 19. You cannot tell me that those people don't know that what they're doing is wrong. But I think it does tap into a culture. We've heard this term toxic masculinity. Well, you get this situation with young men who are in kind of this group dynamic or in a gang. And how many times has this happened where you've had an adult man has confronted them for some sort of antisocial behaviour? Either they're vandalising his house or they're harassing someone else. In the case I quoted before, it was, animal cruelty. And they intervene, and then the teenagers turn on them. This is why people need to be very careful. Um, but it's a pack mentality. And the mindset is, well, I have to be there for my buddy. So they don't stop to think, this is 4-on-1, or this is 5-on-1, or this is 7-on-1. The mindset is just, I need to back up my buddy. So I think there is a toxic masculinity insofar as that gang culture that seriously needs to be challenged. Young men need to know that, it's that's not being a man, that's being a card. So that's why I favor a very hardline approach to this, because I don't think you can communicate this by a softy approach. I think they need to really, really understand what it is like on the receiving end, what it feels like for the victim. I'm not talking about revenge, I'm not talking about doing the same thing to them, but I think that it's far, far too much focus on, well, it's because of lack of opportunities, or it's because of your upbringing, or it's because of, all those things may be a component. I'm not dismissing them, but I have no patience and no respect for the argument that a young offender shouldn't be held to account for what they've done, because it doesn't help anyone. It doesn't even help them, because if there's no deterrent, if you're saying to them, well, you've done this terrible thing, but hey, you didn't have the opportunity, so we'll give you more chances and more chances and more chances. All that will do is enable them. All that will do is say to them they can keep doing it. Now, once in a while, you may have a young offender who shows genuine remorse, but I have seen too many cases where they don't show remorse, where they're galvanized by the leniency, and it makes my blood boil, because innocent people are hurting here. Other young people, families, innocent people are hurting because of the attitude in this country towards young offenders, which is one of overt leniency. Um, I think that there are just too many cases where violent young thugs get a tap on the wrist. And I think it sends out the message to them that they could do as they please. Now, people say, well, if you just throw them in prison, it takes away any opportunity to reform. But what I would argue is if they are already at the point of violently attacking strangers, then it's after the fact. Now, there may be a case for intervention when they're at the point of shoplifting. I still think they should be punished, by the way. So there may be a case of intervention there. But as soon as they start violently attacking strangers, that's not the point where you say, um, oh, well, maybe, if we intervene now, they might change their ways. This is the point where they are already a dangerous offender. And only a tough approach is correct. I mean, for one thing, the public have a right to be kept safe. And if you allow a violent young offender to roam the streets, doing as they please, turning their nose up at a community sentence, it won't change a damn thing. So anyway, I'm going to round this up. There's a few things I want people to really, really consider with what I've said, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. Yes, opportunities are very important. So, I salute anyone who says, I'm opening a boxing club or a youth club to try and, distract young people from a life of crime. That's wonderful. I welcome it. But it shouldn't be an alternative to justice in the sense of, well, this young offender's done this terrible thing, but we'll just bring them to this boxing club and that makes it all right. They have to be accountable. So I support those things as a preventative measure, as a solution to providing opportunities. But I do not support it as an alternative to justice. No way. No way. To me, that's unfathomable, because it's basically a tap on the wrist. It's literally a get out of jail free card. Um, the other thing is, when we talk about toxic masculinity, we need to look at the way young men think when they're in this gang dynamic. Because very often, what they will say if they're accused of, being part of a gang that attacks an individual, they'll always make excuses. They'll say, oh, I didn't mean to kill him. Because there have been fatalities in these cases. I just saw this older man remonstrating with my buddy. When often what that translates as is the older man has, told them off for throwing bricks at a pensioner's house or torturing an animal or whatever other delinquency they're getting up to. So the mentality here is one of no responsibility, and also one of I'll defend my buddies no matter what, even if the buddies are leading them down a bad path. So I think there needs to be more, there needs to be good male role models out there who are saying, if you're in a gang, you're being a coward, fight on your own. So that's why I support boxing clubs because it teaches one-on-one combat. I think that's a good thing. I mean, realistically, you're not going to get young men involved in gangs, to do tennis or a more tranquil sport. Boxing is a natural outlet. And I'm not saying that everyone who goes into boxing will turn away from a life of crime. Some boxers go back to it. But more broadly than not, I would say it's a good thing. It doesn't have to be boxing. It could be rugby. It could be another sport. But, I 100% support it, but not as an alternative to justice, as a preventative measure, but not as an alternative to this is what you've done. You must be held to account for that. I mean, if you get a situation that, say, a young offender has been found guilty of manslaughter because they've been part of a gang that have kicked someone to death, I do not support this mentality of, well, they've been given 12 years, but they should get out in 7, because, well, they'll go to some program where they can change their life around, because 7 years is not enough. I think they should serve their full sentence and then go on to that program. Um, because my concern is being released after 7 years, they'll still be angry. It's still, it takes a long time for a hardened offender to really, really self-reflect. And I'm not claiming to be an expert on this, but it's just common sense. If you give someone a tap on the wrist, or if the punishment doesn't fit the crime, then the offender is going to feel enabled. But I think there's something particularly toxic and frankly frightening about young offenders in this country. Because when you get adult offenders, they do awful, evil things. But actually, when we talk about, I've spoken many times about soft justice. Well, actually, adult offenders, more often than not, do get pretty hefty sentences. So it's not a case that every sentence is soft. Sometimes, they're pretty long, actually. But young offenders, in too many cases, it just doesn't match the gravity of the crime. Now, if a 15 or a 16-year-old has been a part of a gang that's, beaten someone to death, they should not be released in 3 years. No way. It should be, I would say, 8 to 10 years minimum, absolute minimum. There are just too many cases where it just doesn't match the gravity of the crime. But anyway, I don't want to go in circles here, but this is an extremely important issue. And I think it also gets into, this culture of immunity. How many times you see, you know, young offenders just swearing at strangers, doing as they please. It, it's a mentality that I think is enabled by leniency, is enabled by, I'd be in favour of introducing some sort of national service, but not for all young people. Because the reason I wouldn't introduce it universally is because it can take away, it takes away a big chunk of someone's life. 2 years or 1 year. And I wouldn't support, send them into the military for that. But I think as a specific policy for young offenders, as opposed to all young people, but as a specific policy for young offenders, I definitely would welcome it. It's been spoken about before, but it's never really come into fruition. If not that, then some sort of scared straight approach. But I am adamant that the current policy that is adopted in too many places of, well, let's just provide excuses. You have a lack of opportunity, so that's why you're committing crime. It may be one component, but it is used as an excuse. There's no excuse for crime. None. So when it comes to crime and justice, it must be victim centric. And almost universally, victims of crime want to see the people who have hurt them held to account. This doesn't mean that all victims of crime are, flog them and throw away the keys. Some of them would even, be a lot more lenient in their mindset than I would. I can't think of any victim of crime that wouldn't want to see some accountability. Anyway, I'll wrap this up. But basically, I fully support opportunity. I think it's a very good thing. But I also believe in accountability. You cannot have one without the other, and you cannot have justice without judicial punishment. You know, punishment's kind of a taboo word, but it is part of justice. You cannot divorce justice from judicial punishment. You just can't. Because without judicial punishment, there is no justice. And you know, how many families right now are being plagued by antisocial behaviour? How many people are frightened to leave their own home because of antisocial behaviour? Because young offenders are emboldened. And I'm not saying it's only young offenders, you get adult offenders as well, but the difference is they generally do face tougher consequences for the most part. It's just so wrong. And I believe we need a much, much more assertive approach. Let me know your thoughts.